trick that cannot be explained. An Eli Marks short mystery. Written by John Gaspard. Read by Jim Cunningham. I know a trick. That statement may seem self-evident, since I make my living, such as it is, as a magician. What I meant to say is, I know a trick that helps me do my job, particularly when I need to walk up to a group of strangers in a social situation and ask them if they'd like to see some magic. Experience has taught me this sort of sudden intrusion is occasionally unwelcome or, at the very least, unexpected. When I need to accomplish this interruption at a corporate event, a walk-around gig at a company function of some kind, I find dropping a key name is the quickest entry point to granting me instant access to virtually any small group. The name I say changes from company to company, but generally all I need to do is mention the name of the CEO or the highest-ranking person at the event, and I am welcomed in with open arms. "Excuse me," I might say to a small cluster of workers. "Gretchen asked me to show you a little magic tonight. Mind if I do?" Or it might be, "Pardon me, but Dave wanted me to demonstrate something for you. Do you have a second?" There's a lot of power in a person's first name, particularly when that person is in charge. They hear that name, and bingo, I'm in. This ploy works equally well at wedding receptions as I move from table to table during dinner. "Excuse me, but Susan and Mark wanted me to show you something. Do you mind if I interrupt?" Or, "Pardon me, but Mitch and Brian asked me to stop by and entertain you folks for just a few moments." And I'm off and running. I was reviewing the high success rate of my approach as I stood in the basement of this unfamiliar church. Workers were setting out food on the buffet counters, and other volunteers were making the final adjustments to the small centerpieces on each of the tables that filled the low-ceilinged room. The question which was bugging me was this. My approach certainly worked for corporate events, and it worked for weddings. Would it also work at a funeral? I was about to find out. The call had, at first, seemed like any other gig request. Could I perform walk-around magic at an upcoming reception? It was only while gathering further information, the time, the place, the type of gathering, that I realized I was stepping into uncharted territory. My agent, who's raised cluelessness to a high art, seemed unfazed as she rattled off the particulars. "So it's this Saturday at Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception Church in St. Paul. The funeral is at 11 and the lunch and reception will start about noon," Elaine said, clearly reading from what were probably hastily scribbled notes. Whoa, back up a second. I was holding the tip of my pen inches above my own notes, not sure I had heard the details clearly. "Did you say the funeral starts at 11? I could hear her through the phone flipping through notes. "That's what I've got," she finally said. "Why? Is that a weird time for a funeral to start? I'm not Catholic." "Neither am I," said. "But it's not the time that's grabbed my attention. Did you say I'm doing walk-around magic at a funeral?" "Well, no, not at the funeral. At the reception after. Doing it at a funeral might be, I don't know, weird." "Oh, you think so?" I was forming the words to tell her I wasn't interested in the gig when I glanced down at the calendar page in front of me. I had a corporate walk-around event penciled in for 2 weeks from now, but the client had suggested I use a light pencil. I wasn't holding out hope for that one. Other than this possibly disappearing gig, the month was looking pretty sparse work-wise. "Are you available?" Elaine said, sounding more distracted than usual. I could tell her mind was moving on to other clients and other matters. Sure, I said. "I'll need a phone call with the client ahead of time, though, to work out the details." "No problem," Elaine said. "I'll lock it down and text you the deets." True to her word, my phone buzzed about 10 minutes later with the details of the gig and the name and phone number of the client. How are you all doing? Sorry to interrupt, but Sue asked me to stop by and show you one of Neville's favorite card tricks. I ran that sentence over in my mind a couple of times, then tried saying it aloud, quietly, to determine if there might be any clunky consonant clusters I could trip over. It seemed fine in principle, although it really wasn't my introduction I was concerned with. As it turns out, it was the trick itself which was giving me heart palpitations. I had called the client after I spoke to my agent. She was a pleasant, if preoccupied, older woman named Sue. Her distraction seemed perfectly reasonable as she was planning the details of her husband Neville's funeral. And I was one of those details. The conversation was short and direct. In order to help bring out her husband's personality at the event, she wanted me to walk around and perform Neville's favorite card trick. It wasn't until she named the trick that I recognized the problem. "He called it the trick you can't explain," she said. Her tone suggested she wasn't 100% certain she'd gotten the name right. She hadn't, but she was close. "Do you know it?" I said that I did, which was the truth. Had she gone one step further and asked if I knew how to perform it, I would have been hard-pressed to provide a fully honest response. Describing the trick would have been equally difficult. It had come by its title for a reason. It really could not be explained. "Oh, my goodness," my Uncle Harry said with a chuckle. "The trick that cannot be explained, you say? Well, you certainly have put your foot in it, haven't you?" This was followed by another unhelpful chortle. "You can either spend the afternoon laughing at me or instead offer some helpful advice," I said, snapping a bit more than intended. "There's nothing saying I can't do both," Harry replied, then held up a hand to silence any response on my part. "Calm yourself, Eli, not to worry. I can talk you through it. That is, up to a point." He gestured toward an empty chair at his table. He was seated in a back corner of the bar next to our magic store, Chicago Magic. The store, like the bar, was empty on this cloudy, almost rainy Wednesday afternoon. I was 3 days away from the funeral reception and really beginning to regret I had agreed to the gig. "Di Vernon gave the trick that name because it's never really the same trick twice," Harry began. He was shifting into lecture mode, so I settled myself back in my chair. "It's sort of the magical equivalent of jazz, really." "Okay, so what's the structure?" I was feeling I might need to take some notes and did a quick search of my pockets. No paper, which was fine because I also had no pen. "Well, I'd say there's a beginning, middle, and an end, but that isn't always the case. It could be the reverse. The middle can be the end. It might never get past the beginning, or when the end appears, it isn't where you thought you were headed. That's the beauty of the trick." "And what is the trick?" "In its simplest form, the trick is what happens and what you make of what's happened. You need to be totally in the moment while simultaneously looking back and forward." "Looking back at what?" "At what's happened so far," he said with a sly grin, "and also at everything you've ever learned about magic, specifically, but not always, card magic." "You're beginning to sound like a crazed Zen master or a drunken Yoda." "Again, that's why Vernon named it the way he did. It's less about moves and sleights, although those are vital to your success, and more about being in the moment and open to all possibilities. The trick, in its purest form, will be different every time." "So the guy whose funeral this is, Neville, he must have been a pretty good magician if this was his favorite trick." Harry nodded, slowly. "It's certainly not for the beginner, but it's also not for the faint of heart. I know plenty of top-notch magicians who wouldn't perform it on a bet." "Why?" "Well, I wouldn't say it depends on luck, because I've always believed that with the right mindset, you can make your own luck. But the simple fact is, it doesn't work all the time. That is to say, a good magician can always produce a result, but it won't necessarily be a miracle. But when it works, oh, Nelly, stand back, because it can be spectacular. Let me demonstrate. Do you have a deck of cards? Better yet, 2 decks? While I may not consistently have paper or pen on my person, I always carry a couple of standard decks with me. I handed the cards to Harry, and the lesson began. Just as Alice stepped through the looking glass into a puzzling new imaginative world, over the next 2 hours, Harry guided me through the Byzantine maze which was the trick that cannot be explained. While I recognized versions of some of the effects he produced, I also witnessed miracles I couldn't explain. The results were sometimes mind-blowing, sometimes merely interesting, but every time the process and the result were not only different, but seemingly casual, unrehearsed, unplanned, often unfathomable. It might be that all 4 aces appeared at once at the top of the deck, or that your volunteer suddenly dealt out a winning hand of poker, or that the match to a card thought of by your helper appeared within the seemingly empty card box on the table. The number of outcomes appeared to be limited only by my imagination and skill, limitations with which I was intimately familiar, which was why the trick absolutely terrified me. Although I wasn't scheduled to work until noon, I showed up an hour earlier so I could be there for the funeral as well. It was partly out of respect, but also because I wanted to get the lay of the land and to get a sense of the man whose favorite trick I was about to perform multiple times. I made a quick check of the reception area in the church's basement, which was still in the process of being set up. Then I went back upstairs to find a seat, which was a trick unto itself. The place was packed. I finally was able to squeeze into a pew about a third of the way back and on the side. Then I settled in for the funeral. By the end of the service, I felt like the biggest waste of space on this planet. Neville sounded amazing. Big-hearted, funny, the go-to guy in a crisis, your best friend, your wisest critic. Neville was extolled by speaker after speaker during the hour-long service. From nonprofit boards to overseeing pet adoptions to speaking on climate issues to bridge, backgammon, and Scrabble clubs, Neville did it all. I couldn't see how he'd had any extra time to become a master magician, but then that's just who Neville was. He wasn't just lauded, he was loved. The same sentiments kept surfacing through all the remarks, but one guy, a friend from high school, seemed to say it best. The thing about Neville was that you always came away from every encounter with him feeling you had been given a gift of some kind. I don't know how he did that. There was a murmur of agreement from the large crowd, and then the old friend went on to recount yet another of the seemingly endless acts of kindness Neville had bestowed. Any pressure I had felt about doing justice to his favorite trick rose exponentially as the service went on. Someone who was that amazing clearly deserved a top-notch performance, and I really wasn't convinced I was the guy to deliver it. Make no mistake, I bombed before plenty of times, but the idea of bombing at a funeral really offered its own tragic implications. To sum up, I wasn't in a good place. My only consolation was that my current situation, such as it was just slightly more positive than the guest of honor, but not by much. I followed the large crowd as they filed out of the sanctuary and down the narrow steps to the basement reception hall. As I entered the low-ceilinged room, I was delighted to discover that, With the exception of the several food-laden buffet tables, the room was filled wall to wall with tabletops. While there was a little standing room around the sides, the layout was designed to force people to grab some food and sit down. I doubt it had been devised with my needs in mind, but I was nonetheless happy with the outcome. The thing about the trick, or actually the series of card tricks I was about to perform, was that I pretty much had to do it at a table. Either I could be seated, or my spectators could be seated, or we could all be seated, but it wasn't something I could do with any great flexibility if I were standing and they were clustered around me, holding drinks or small plates of appetizers. I stood there for a long moment as the rest of the crowd oozed in around me. In a normal walk-around situation, I would have dived right in, finding a small group and starting to perform. Something, anything, that would quickly grab the attention of an intimate bunch of attendees. But that wasn't going to happen here. I had to wait for people to go through the buffet line, get some food, and then sit down, which meant basically I had more time to think and more time to worry and more time to squirm. Finally, one of the tables filled up and I stepped forward. I was feeling like an amateur skydiver about to jump for the first time. I was not at all certain I had packed my parachute properly. I took a deep breath, approached the table, and jumped in head first. Sorry to interrupt, but Sue asked me to go around and perform Neville's favorite magic trick for folks. Would you like to see it? They agreed to the proposition, and I was off and running. And I kept running for the next hour, from table to table, one right after the other. There was no need to reset. When I'd finished at one table, I just grabbed the cards and moved on to the next group. The time sailed by like a slow-motion blur, and boy, did I work! In order to pull off the trick that cannot be explained, I had to be completely present and in the moment. Every single moment. And the truly amazing thing was, it was paying off. It's like the stars had aligned in my favor. I'd get to a new table, set up a new situation, pick a card, think of a card, give me a number between 1 and 20. I never knew until I said it just what the setup might be. And moments later, I'd floor them with a trick which used that information to great effect. It was weird. Really weird. And understand this. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in unseen hands from the beyond reaching down and orchestrating events. But I couldn't deny what was happening. I was doing Neville's favorite trick, the trick that cannot be explained, at his funeral, and it was working virtually every time. Was I in the midst of some actual, true, paranormal experience? Were all my years of debunking coming back to literally haunt me? Was this some sort of cosmic comeuppance? The universe shaking a finger at me saying, "Hey, remember everything you thought you knew? Well, buddy, think again." Was that what was happening? To say I was spooked might be an understatement. I tried to reassure myself by imagining what Uncle Harry would be saying in this situation. "You make your own luck, Eli. That's all this is. This is not supernatural. This is not the ghost of Neville reaching out to you from the beyond, guiding your hand, stacking the deck, and making things, amazing things happen. This is just you, a good magician with solid skills, who has learned the difficult art of how to take advantage of a situation and make miracles out of it." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe I was just that good. Of course, I knew I wasn't. I mean, I'm pretty good. I'm better than the average guy off the street. But this level? This number of miracles, one after another? I was supposed to actually believe that somehow I was doing that? That seemed at best unlikely. To say I was feeling mixed emotions would be an understatement. I moved steadily and methodically from table to table, each time introducing myself with the same pre-planned introduction. "Sorry to disturb you, but Sue asked me to perform Neville's favorite card trick for you," never really knowing what I was going to do after that sentence. Yet somehow, I always seemed to know. Every time the next sentence came to me. It was never the same sentence. I was always entirely in the moment, and amazing things happened, one after another. I began to feel like the bishop in the movie Caddyshack, who in the midst of a tremendous rainy downpour hits amazing golf shots again and again. At one point he says something like, "I'm having the greatest game of my life." And then he misses a shot and swears to the heavens. A moment later, he's struck down by a bolt of lightning. I was waiting for that moment to happen to me. When would lightning strike me down? The tables for the reception were arranged in a large circle, with another circle of tables within that circle. In the center was a lone table, which was reserved for the widow, where she was seated with what appeared to be close friends and relatives. I had started the gig on the large outer circle, then moved to the smaller inner circle. My last table was literally the last table in the center of the room. I introduced myself to Sue, offering condolences and thanking her for the chance to perform Neville's favorite trick one last time. "Oh, thank you, Eli," Sue said, smiling broadly. She was a tiny woman with beautiful, stark white hair. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it. "Neville would have been so pleased." "It's been my honor," I said, and I really meant it. This had been a day like no other. "Do the trick for us," someone said from the other side of the table. I looked down at Sue, and she nodded. "I would love to see it again," she said quietly. So I launched into the unknown one final time. Was it the best version that afternoon? Maybe not, but it was darn good. I used two volunteers. One had chosen a card which had appeared with a simple cut in the middle of the deck, while the other's card was found all by itself in the empty card box. The table applauded at the conclusion, and I looked down at Sue, who was smiling up at me. "Oh, Eli, that was wonderful," she said. "But that's not Neville's trick." I was sure I hadn't heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" "That's not Neville's trick," she repeated. "Yes, I know it's different every time," I began, but Sue cut me off. "No, it was always the same, always exactly the same." She turned to an older gentleman on her right. "George, you know how the trick goes, don't you?" "I should say I do," he said with a grim chuckle. "Neville did it every chance he got. I must have seen it 1,000 times." He put his hand out, and I surrendered the cards, not sure what I had done wrong or where this was headed. George quickly counted out a few cards and then spread the small packet face up for a guest across the table. "Irene, I want you to pick one of these cards. Don't tell me what you picked, though. Have you picked one?" The woman nodded, and George began to deal out the cards into 3 piles of 7 cards each, all face up. I'm sure my expression must have reflected, at least to a degree, the turmoil I was suddenly feeling. This guy was doing the 21 card trick, the simplest, most common trick on the planet. It was the go-to routine for virtually any layperson who insisted on performing a trick for me after learning I was a magician. This was Neville's favorite trick? "I'm sorry," I said as I looked down at Sue. I'm sure my utter confusion was evident in my voice. "I thought Neville's favorite trick was the trick that cannot be explained." "Oh, it was," she agreed, nodding along. "Any time I'd ask him how it was done, Neville always said the same thing. Honey, it's complicated. It's a math thing. It's one of those tricks I just can't explain. So that's what we always called it, the trick I can't explain. I was suddenly hit with a hard punch of clarity right to the face. I must have misheard her on the phone. Had I asked a follow-up question, any follow-up question, I surely would have quickly realized the trick she was describing. However, I'd gone down a completely different and much more agonizing road altogether. I suddenly felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. I looked down as George continued through the simple steps that always brought the 21 card trick to its inevitable and satisfying conclusion. He successfully revealed Irene's chosen card and was greeted by polite applause by the rest of his table mates. Still feeling numb, I collected my cards and once again offered the widow my heartfelt condolences. I then stepped away from the table and scanned the room. I knew they had a buffet, but I had a more pressing question. Was there also a bar of some kind? I didn't mean to shut the place down. It just worked out that way. Turns out there was no bar. It was a church basement, after all. But there was still some food left on the buffet. Although I was emotionally and physically spent from performing the trick that cannot be explained for over an hour, I was also hungry. So I grabbed the last of the sliced ham sandwiches and the remaining scoop of potato salad, speared a couple of recalcitrant pickles and a dollop of something that looked like a lime jello salad, and then I sat down, hard, at the first chair I found. The crowd had thinned out to just a trickle of people, and even these stragglers looked like they were about to head out. But I wasn't ready to go. I needed a few minutes to process what had just happened. I was deeply mired in my thoughts when I felt a presence next to me. It was George, the fellow at Sue's table who had performed Neville's actual favorite card trick. He slid effortlessly into the chair next to me. "Funerals, huh?" he finally said. "You got that right," I agreed. "Did you know him, Neville?" I shook my head, but judging by his eulogies, he was a heck of a guy. "That he was." We sat in silence for a few moments longer. I could see some of the catering staff starting to eye us. I think they were ready to go home and wanted us to do the same. "That was a great card trick you did," George finally said. "Neville would have loved it." "Yours was swell as well," I said. George shrugged. "I saw him do that darn thing so many times I could probably do it in my sleep. That was the thing about Neville. You hung around him enough, you just picked things up by osmosis. You didn't even realize it at the time, but you'd look back and realize he'd given you this gift, and you weren't even aware when it happened. Know what I mean?" I looked over at George and thought about the preceding 4 days, about the lesson I'd had with Harry and all the practicing, and then performing that trick, that impossible trick, at table after table, and not just getting through it, but really succeeding with it. "Yeah, I think I do," I said. Neville was one heck of a good magician. George and I talked about Neville for another hour while the catering staff packed away all their gear. We were still chatting about him long after they'd left. This has been The Trick That Cannot Be Explained, an Eli Marks short mystery. Written by John Gaspard. Read by Jim Cunningham. Text copyright 2022. Production copyright 2022. All rights reserved. Recorded by Albertsbridge Books at Grass Lake Studios. Looking for more Eli Marks? Find all the books in the series in ebook, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook formats at your favorite bookseller or at EliMarksMysteries.com. That's ELIMARKS Mysteries.com. And thanks for listening.